If we look at the bottom part of page 1, Australia's free trade policies, we can see Australia began reducing its barriers to trade in 1975 when tariffs were cut by 25% across the board. Before this point, Australia was a highly protected economy. And the key thing that caused this to happen in 1975, and it was actually considered a bit of a failure by a lot of economists, was the fact that Australia had stagflation at that time. High inflation, high unemployment caused by the oil shock of the early to mid-70s. And Australia was also running a current account surplus at the time. And so the idea of cutting barriers to trade was not really a huge problem. The bigger problem were the internal factors, the internal problems of high unemployment, high inflation, low economic growth, and the idea of cutting barriers to trade was that it would reduce inflation. And we'll see that that actually is one of the major impacts of particularly cutting tariffs. That was also, funnily enough, the last time Australia ran a current account surplus, so it was the last time that was used as a reason. Moving on, reductions to barriers to trade picked up from 1988 onwards, with the aim of forcing domestic firms to become, and here's the three different descriptions you can use for it, more outward looking, so become more export orientated, to become more responsive to consumer demands, so to be more innovative, and to promote structural change. And there we're talking about allocative efficiency. Remember, we have 3 types of efficiencies. Anyone remember what the 3 types of efficiency were? I've given you one there. Very good. So 1 is dynamic, which you gave me. 2 is allocative, which I've written there. And what is the third one? And 3 is technical. Very good. Technical. Allocative efficiency, which is the one mentioned there, what it talks about is allocating resources within the economy. So are we allocating our resources to the car industry or to the mining industry or to services? Technical efficiency is how much productivity exists in each of those industries. So how much output can you get for each unit of input? Can we now produce 3 cars for every worker, whereas last year we could only produce 2 cars for every worker? Okay, it's different to allocative efficiency. That's how you allocate your resources between industries. Technical efficiency is how much output you get for each additional unit of resource. Dynamic efficiency is the hardest one to understand and also the hardest one to get, and that is being responsive to changes in the economy, being able to innovate, and removing barriers to trade, exposing trade industries or trade exposed industries to these sorts of market forces is designed also to improve dynamic efficiency to an extent, to have them innovate, respond to changes a lot more. Final point, non-tariff barriers were also removed with quotas, subsidies and local content rules gradually phased out. Today there are very few or almost none of those remaining. However, Australia's strict quarantine rules have been criticised as heavily protecting the domestic agriculture sector. Do you guys remember a few years ago, Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, had those TV ads where he said, "Don't let these guys in, they're going to ruin our environment, you know, these little bugs. You'll be fined, you can't bring them in through customs." Or quarantine is the correct term, would have been. Quarantine prevents living organisms from entering the country. Customs, what that is it's about paying taxes, so that's your tariffs. Quarantine is about preventing predominantly microorganisms, any living things that aren't native to Australia in particular that could cause an imbalance to the Australian environment. Because Australia is an island continent, an island country, we have been protected from a lot of those things. And however, quarantine has been criticised for being de facto trade protection. And to some extent, or to a large extent, it has that impact. But it's something that a lot of economists would say no is different to trade protection, is required to be in place in a way that trade protection that stifles these types of efficiencies do not. Any questions about that first page? No, if we go on to the next one. So a bit more on Australia's free trade policies. Today Australia is one of the least protected economies in the world. Most goods are tariff-free. There is a 5% tariff on manufactured goods. And high tariffs on TFC. TFC, you might hear about, it's textiles, footwear and clothing. They have tariffs of about 10%. The car industry also used to have tariffs that were above that 5% figure. Today it's come down to about 5%. With some of the countries we have free trade agreements with, they've actually fallen to below 5%, down to almost or to 0. And soon they're going to be done away with because they're going to count as what's called a nuisance tariff. Nuisance tariffs are tariffs on goods and services that aren't produced in Australia. Okay, so any goods and services that aren't produced in Australia do not have a tariff on them, and those were some of the first tariffs to be removed because there was no purpose having them. The average tariff was 36% in 1969. It's fallen to 19% in 1987 and then 1.8% in 2011. And there's a table showing you how it's come down. And you can see there was a big cut from the 60s to the 70s. That was the 25% across the board tariff cuts. So all tariffs were cut by a quarter. And it was in the late 80s that it really started to fall quite a bit. Now, why is it that we encourage free trade? It's all about these improvements in efficiency. And if you think about it in terms of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and if you have space in your handout, or if you have space in your book under the title, under the heading rather, Australia's, or free trade and protection in Australia, I'd recommend drawing this diagram there. So we have the price level, or CPI, as your vertical axis, and then real GDP here on your horizontal axis, 0. You've got your aggregate supply and your aggregate demand over here. Okay, and that gives us our initial point of equilibrium, which is P0 and Y0, and it's going to be an AS0. What does free trade allow? It allows an opening up to more markets, it encourages innovation, it allows economies of scale, it makes firms more outward looking, it allows a cut in prices because consumers and firms are able to find a wider variety of goods at lower prices. And so what that does is, it pushes your aggregate supply curve to the right from AS0 to AS1. Okay, so it shifts your aggregate supply curve to the right. And you get to a new point of equilibrium at Y1, P1. We like this a lot as economists. As economists, you're going to love this sort of graph because, or this movement, because your prices come down, but your income goes up. Ideally, that is the ultimate, the preferred option. In theory. In practice, it's a lot more complicated. But in theory, you have lower prices, so it increases your purchasing power, and you also have increased income. So you actually have a greater level of income with which to buy things. And that's the idea of what free trade and reduction in trade barriers is meant to achieve. Of course, that's in the long term. In the short term, we're going to see there are a lot of drawbacks, a lot of disadvantages, and this isn't exactly how it works, particularly in the short term. But the long-term goal is to achieve this, to unleash market forces, to allow the new point of equilibrium to be reached, to have higher incomes, lower prices, greater levels of economic output.
I will do this short interview in English because I have many friends who live abroad, all over the world, and for many of them they don't speak or understand German, so it would be better if I do it in the basic international lingua franca, which is nowadays English. So please, I'll carry on. My name is George Downing. I work in security. I've been working in security here in Germany since 1997. I've worked in some aspects of middle to high risk security on public transport, having to deal with violence on public transport with football hooligans, junkies, dealers, as well as also doing a little bit of auf Deutsch unbewaffnet Personenschutz, which in English basically means like being a minder, being a bodyguard, but unarmed. I have a good group of people here. I've always believed personally in the end I'd rather have a small group of highly dedicated people than having a massive group of people who are only half interested in what I have to teach. Basically what I teach here is, to put it in simple terms, it's not politically correct, but basically it's the appliance of violence to save yourself or your loved ones or people, your family or whatever, in an emergency situation. The problem is to say that it is not politically correct, but then I don't believe in political correctness. When something has to be said, then you should say it and come out with it direct. Okay, well, my original training The whole idea originally began because I became very disillusioned with traditional martial arts as they were taught. I was very frank with myself and I asked myself a brutally honest question, which I think everyone should. And that question is, would it work in a real situation if my life depended on it? And if you're equally brutally honest with yourself when you answer this question, the answer will probably be no. In fact, a lot of it will not work. In fact, a lot of it will probably get me killed or very badly injured if I was to apply it in a real situation. I came into this training because I saw at the time in Germany, when I was working in security, that they didn't have anything like this at all in Germany. It was quite common in England under the heading of reality-based self-defense, which was becoming big. It was also at the time in England in the mid to late 90s when Krav Maga and other martial arts were becoming big names in England. I remember at the time in the late 90s, if you went in Germany, if you said to somebody Krav Maga, they would give you a sort of, huh? What? Was ist das there? What's that? You know, they didn't have, at the time, all you had was just very traditional martial arts. And seeing that I'd become very disillusioned with traditional martial arts, or perhaps the way how they were taught, in particular, I decided to look for something that was more realistic and different.
Ich komme momentan einmal die Woche hierher und finde, das ist eine gute Frequenz, mache gerne weiter und habe das Gefühl, dass ich hier wirklich was lerne.
Wir wollten gerne was zusammen machen und es war schwierig in unserem kleinen Städtchen was zu finden. Ja, und wir suchten halt eine Sportart, die flexibel ist und nicht nur auf Vereinszugehörigkeit stoßen möchte. Und deswegen haben wir gesagt, okay, wenn das was Freies ist, dann kommen wir gerne hier hin. Und das war hier so. Unverbindlich und mit viel Spaß und Humor.
Vom Jiu-Jitsu in die andere Branche. Effektiver.
Praxisorientierte Selbstverteidigung.
Ohne Schnickschnack.
Ohne Schnickschnack. Ich bin durch eine Kollegin hier hängen geblieben, die hat was gesucht, um letztendlich Selbstvertrauen aufzubauen und hat das auch gewonnen, hat aber aufgehört. Ich bin irgendwie, weil das eine coole Truppe ist, irgendwie hängen geblieben. Und ja, die Technik ist effektiv und es taugt auch als Fitnesstraining, würde ich sagen. Und mentale Stärke auf Dauer.
Ruhe bewahren.
Genau.
Ich glaube, ein wichtiger Grund ist, dass ich jetzt zum zweiten Mal Vater werde und ich einfach wissen möchte, was ich machen kann, wenn wir in irgendeine gefährliche Situation rauskommen sollten. Weil das Aggressionspotenzial draußen wird immer höher. Und vorher als normaler Sterblicher hat man halt keine Ahnung, was man machen soll, wenn ein Angreifer kommt oder mehrere oder. Ich habe so darum gesagt, jetzt musst du mal gucken, dass du irgendwas machst. Und darum bin ich in die gegangen. Das ist schon super. Ein Sportschütze. Top-Trainer.
Ich finde, die Kriminalität, die steigt halt und um mich selbst zu verteidigen und eigentlich mir auch selber die Sicherheit zu geben, dass ich mich verteidigen kann, habe ich mich entschieden, einfach so einen Selbstverteidigungskurs mitzumachen. Mir macht es auf jeden Fall Spaß. Es ist manchmal ein bisschen grob, aber ich meine, da muss man durch. Wenn einer dich angreift, ist ja auch das Gleiche. Da wird ja auch keine Rücksicht genommen.
Ja, also ich mache es schon auch aufgrund der Fähigkeit, die man hier lernt und aufgrund der Techniken. Und ich glaube, Fitness muss auch nebenbei jeder für sich selbst noch ein bisschen trainieren. Aber George ist halt derjenige, der wirklich weiß, wovon er spricht und der einem auch Techniken beibringen kann, die dann in seiner Arbeit auch bisher funktioniert haben. Und das ist, glaube ich, ziemlich wertvoll.
Wir wiederholen immer alles in die Reflexe. Ja, das denn?
Man wird sensibilisiert
Ja, genau.
und durch diese Sensibilisierung steht man einem gegenüber schon kräftiger da. Und fürs Empfinden, fürs Selbstbewusstsein ist das, merkt man. Wissen, dass man was kann, aber es nicht annehmen muss. Weil man wird auch hier ganz klar geschult, dass man gesagt bekommt,
Wegrennen.
weggehen und die Leute sein lassen, wie sie wollen. Na, aber man kommt schon mal in mögliche Situationen, wo die Möglichkeit besteht, dass man es braucht. Und ich denke, das ist genau das, was wir hier suchen und auch gefunden haben. Und ist das irgendwo im Hinterkopf und dann wendest du es an und es funktioniert. Es ist auf jeden Fall nicht das platschige Fallen und es ist auch nicht das plumpe Zuschlagen, sondern auch hier die Truppe ist natürlich, man muss auch sagen, dass das hier eine Industrietruppe ist. Ja, wir sind ja bunt gemischt. Von minderjährig bis zu älteren Leuten, finde ich total toll. Jeder bringt etwas mit und lustig ist es auch. Ja, und wir kommen eigentlich hier recht gut ins Schwitzen.
Na, hier kann man eigentlich richtig viel mitnehmen. Man ist sehr ausgepowert, wenn man zu Hause ankommt.